The village of Black Hollow sat on the edge of the Avonvale forest, a place whispered about in hushed tones even on the brightest days. The trees stood unnaturally tall and close together, their canopies blocking the sun and casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. Few dared to enter. Those who did rarely returned, and those who did were forever changed, silent, pale, and haunted by dreams they could not explain. The first child to vanish was little Ada Marston. Barely 6 winters old, she'd wandered too close to the woods while chasing her favourite doll. By the time her mother realised she was missing, only a faint trail of footprints led to the tree line before abruptly disappearing. The villagers formed a search party, armed with torches and blades. They found no trace of the girl, but discovered something else. Strange symbols carved deep into the bark of the trees, circles with jagged lines slashed through them, crude drawings of a tall, faceless figure with impossibly long arms. The elders of Black Hollow spoke of an old tale, whispered from generation to generation, about Der Schlanke Mann, or the Tall Man. Long before the village was built, the forest was said to be home to a nameless being. It preyed on the weak, the lost, and the desperate, luring them into the shadows with whispers only they could hear. When 2 more children vanished within weeks of Ada's disappearance, the whispers began again. Parents forbade their children from playing near the woods. Yet even indoors they claimed to hear soft voices calling their names at night. The disappearance of Isaac Greaves, a boy of 9, shattered the already fragile calm. His mother, Eleanor, could not bear the loss. She refused to accept that he was gone and clung to a desperate hope. One moonless night, she lit a lantern and set out alone, slipping past the other villagers into the forest. The woods seemed alive with movement. Shadows danced just out of reach of her light, and every snap of a twig made her heart leap. "Isaac!" she called, her voice trembling. Only the forest answered, its unnatural silence pressing in on her. As she ventured deeper, Eleanor found herself surrounded by trees carved with the same symbols described by the search party. Her lantern flickered, and she began to hear it. A soft, almost melodic whisper. It wasn't Isaac's voice, but it sounded close. So close. "Isaac!" she whispered, clutching the lantern tighter. The whisper grew louder, closer, yet still she saw no one. Then her lantern's light caught something, a faint outline, impossibly tall, standing just beyond the trees. It didn't move, yet its presence radiated a cold, suffocating dread. Eleanor stepped back, and her foot caught on something. Looking down, she saw Ada's doll, its fabric smeared with dirt and blood. The whispers turned into a low, guttural hum, filling her ears. When she looked up again, the figure was closer, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally toward her. Eleanor screamed, and the lantern fell from her hand, shattering and plunging the forest into darkness. She was never seen again. The villagers found her lantern the next morning, its broken glass dusted with ash. Around it were dozens of footprints, too large to belong to any man and too deep to belong to any animal. After that, Black Hollow began to empty. Families packed what they could carry and fled, unwilling to risk their lives or their children's. Only a few remained, and they never spoke of the forest again. But the legend of the Tall Man lived on, whispered in the shadows, carried by the wind, waiting for the next unwary soul to listen. By the late 1800s, the legend of the Tall Man had crossed oceans, whispered by immigrants who carried tales of their homeland to the New World. In every country, the details shifted slightly, but the essence remained, an impossibly tall figure, featureless and silent, who preyed upon the vulnerable. For Professor Edgar Forsyth, an academic in folklore and anthropology, these stories were more than superstitions, they were a puzzle. Over years of research, he compiled dozens of accounts. Tales from German peasants of Der Schlanke Mann, Norse sagas about Grimlim, and stories from the Americas of the Tall Hunger. The similarities were striking and the patterns too consistent to ignore. Forsyth's obsession deepened when he discovered a recurring symbol tied to these tales, a circle with an X carved through it, sometimes painted in blood, sometimes drawn in ash. It appeared in villages where children went missing, on ancient stones in abandoned forests, even on the walls of a chapel long since burned to the ground. Intrigued, he set out to investigate. His journey led him to a remote village in England's Lake District, where disappearances had sparked panic. The villagers were tight-lipped, but Forsyth found a willing informant in a farmer named Reginald Pike, whose grandson had vanished 2 weeks prior. "It started with the dreams," Reginald explained, his voice trembling. "The boy said he saw a man in the woods, tall, with arms that stretched like rope. Then he found this." Reginald handed Forsyth a piece of bark etched with the circle and X symbol. He brought it home like it was a treasure. 3 nights later, he was gone. Forsyth inspected the crude symbol and felt a strange unease, as if the etching were watching him. Determined to uncover the truth, Forsyth ventured into the woods at dusk, guided by Reginald's directions. The air grew colder as he entered, and the shadows seemed to deepen unnaturally. He spotted more symbols carved into the trees, each one more intricate than the last. He paused at the base of an ancient oak. The ground beneath it was disturbed, as though someone, or something, had clawed at the dirt. Forsyth crouched to examine it and found a tiny wooden doll buried among the roots. Its head was missing, and its arms were grotesquely elongated, as if mimicking the figure described in the legends. The air grew heavy, and a faint whisper brushed past his ears. At first he thought it was the wind, but the sound began to form words. "Forsyth! Forsyth!" He spun around, the hair on his neck rising. "Who's there?" he demanded. The forest was silent, but the whispers continued, soft, melodic, and beckoning. Against his better judgment, Forsyth followed them, his lantern casting flickering light across the gnarled trees. The path ended in a clearing, and there it stood. The figure was impossibly tall, its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its faceless head tilted as if studying him. Forsyth froze, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his feet were rooted to the ground. The whispers grew louder, and the figure began to move, not walking, but gliding, its arms outstretched. Forsyth's vision blurred, and his mind filled with images, a child's laughter cut short, a mother's anguished scream, and the carved symbols pulsating like a heartbeat. When Forsyth awoke, he was back in the village, lying on the cobblestone road. Reginald found him and shook him awake, demanding answers, but Forsyth couldn't speak of what he'd seen, not fully. Over the weeks that followed, he became increasingly paranoid. He saw the figure everywhere, in the corner of his study, reflected in windows, and even in the ink smudges of his notes. The circle and X symbol began to appear in his sketches, unbidden. His colleagues dismissed him as mad, but Forsyth knew the truth. The tall man was not a myth, but a predator, ancient and unrelenting. Worse, Forsyth feared he'd been marked. His final journal entry, dated 3 months after his encounter, read, "It watches, it waits, and it follows. There is no escaping it, for once you've seen it, it never lets you go." Forsyth disappeared the following day. His home was found in disarray, his research scattered, and etched into the wood of his desk was the symbol of the Watcher's mark, a circle with an X slashed through it. The year was 1913, and the mining town of Elmwood thrived in the shadow of the Blackthorn Ridge. The mines were its lifeblood, churning out coal and precious minerals. But there was something about the ridge that locals avoided discussing. Every family in Elmwood had their own quiet warnings about wandering too close to the forest that bordered the town. When 16-year-old Maggie Hayes vanished near the mines one foggy evening, her disappearance was mourned, but not entirely unexpected. "The ridge doesn't give up its own," the elders muttered, their faces grim. The miners, however, couldn't afford superstition. They worked the earth tirelessly, descending into darkness every day with only their lanterns and tools. Yet even among them, a chill had begun to spread. It started as murmurs of strange noises, a faint rhythmic tapping that didn't match the sound of pickaxes or falling rock. "I swear I heard someone calling my name down there," muttered Joseph Grady, one of the veteran miners, over a pint at the tavern. "It weren't no echo either. It was closer." The tension escalated when the foreman discovered a series of strange carvings on the mine walls. The symbols were crude but unmistakable, circles slashed through with jagged X's, much like those described in Black Hollow's folklore decades earlier. No one admitted to carving them, and their appearance made the miners uneasy. Then came the collapse. It happened on a damp October morning. A section of the mine's lower levels caved in, trapping 7 men. The rescue team worked frantically, and after 12 grueling hours, they managed to pull out 3 survivors. One of them, Albert Finch, was found clutching a lantern, his face pale and his eyes wild. "He's down there," he whispered as they carried him out. "Tall as the devil." Took the others, pulled him into the dark. The rescuers dismissed his ramblings as delirium, but Albert's words spread like wildfire through Elmwood. He refused to elaborate further, retreating into a state of silent terror. Within a week, he was found hanging in his home, a jagged circle and X symbol carved into his bedroom wall. Meanwhile, the 3 missing miners were presumed dead until one of their bodies was discovered. A hunter stumbled upon it deep in the blackthorn forest, miles from the mines. The man's face was frozen in a rictus of fear, his limbs bent at unnatural angles. Surrounding the body were dozens of crude wooden effigies, all shaped like a tall, faceless figure with unnaturally long arms. Elmwood spiraled into panic. More villagers reported seeing the figure at the edge of the forest or in the shadows of their homes. Children complained of nightmares in which the man with no face watched them from the darkness. When young Timothy Cross vanished from his bed, the town reached its breaking point. A mob armed with torches and hunting rifles marched into the blackthorn forest, determined to destroy whatever had been tormenting them. The search party found nothing, no monster, no trace of Timothy. But they returned with a strange discovery, a clearing littered with piles of coal dust and broken lanterns, surrounded by trees etched with the circle and X symbol. The townsfolk abandoned Elmwood soon after. The mine was sealed, and the town fell into disrepair, its buildings left to rot beneath the weight of the ridge's shadow. Travellers who stumbled upon the ruins reported an eerie stillness, as if the land itself had been silenced. But some claimed to hear whispers in the wind, faint and melodic, calling names they didn't recognize. And in the centre of the old town square, carved into the cracked fountain, was the symbol that had haunted Elmwood until its dying breath. A circle slashed through with an X. The tall man had claimed another place for his domain. In 1937, the First Baptist Church of New Haven burned to the ground, leaving behind a trail of mysteries and hushed whispers that would plague the town for decades. The church had been a cornerstone of the community, a towering wooden structure with stained glass windows that depicted saints and angels. It was led by Reverend Thomas Vickery, a man beloved for his charisma and devotion. But in the months leading up to the fire, a darkness seemed to settle over the congregation. It began subtly. Parishioners arriving late to Sunday service claimed to hear soft whispers coming from the trees lining the churchyard. Others spoke of shadowy figures glimpsed through the high windows during evening sermons, always standing perfectly still. The children of New Haven began waking in the night, crying about the tall man who stood outside their windows. "He has no face," one little girl sobbed to her mother, "but he's watching me." Reverend Vickery dismissed the stories as fanciful rumours, blaming the fear on stress from the looming war in Europe. But his demeanour began to change. He grew distant, his sermons darker and more urgent. He spoke often of sin and repentance, of unseen forces preying upon the weak. One fateful evening, Reverend Vickery announced a special midnight vigil, inviting only his most faithful followers. Those who attended were never seen again. When the church failed to open the next morning, worried families forced their way inside. What they found chilled them to the bone. The pews were empty, the air heavy with the scent of ash and decay. On the walls were carvings, hundreds of them, depicting the same figure, tall, faceless, and surrounded by jagged limbs. The altar was piled high with what appeared to be personal belongings, necklaces, lockets, and even children's toys. In the center of the altar was a single wooden effigy, its spindly arms stretched toward the ceiling. The whispers began that night. Throughout New Haven, residents reported hearing faint melodic voices drifting through the air. Some claimed to see shapes moving in the shadows of their homes or faces, vague and formless, watching from their windows. The church burned 3 days later. Witnesses described the fire as unnatural, with flames leaping high into the sky, yet leaving the surrounding trees untouched. No one could explain how it started. The following morning, searchers combing through the wreckage found no bodies, no remains of the missing congregation. Instead, they discovered the altar untouched by the flames. The wooden effigy sat in its place, unburned and unbroken. Beneath it, etched deeply into the stone floor, was the now familiar symbol, a circle with an X slashed through it. New Haven fell into a grim silence after the fire. Families moved away, and the churchyard was left to the creeping vines and moss. Years later, a historian researching local legends uncovered a chilling detail. The names of the missing congregation members appeared sporadically across the country in police reports. Some were listed as victims of unsolved disappearances, others were accused of unthinkable crimes. Yet all shared one detail. Before they vanished or acted, they had reported vivid dreams of the tall man. The effigy was eventually removed by a team of archaeologists who studied the site. Its fate is unknown. Some say it was taken to a museum, though no record of it exists. Others believe it was destroyed. But the people of New Haven know better. The whispers still drift through the air on certain nights, faint and melodic, calling names no one recognizes. And deep in the overgrown churchyard, hidden among the trees, stands a single wooden figure with spindly limbs stretched toward the sky. In the fall of 1954, the Willowbrook Home for Boys stood on the outskirts of a crumbling industrial town. Once a grand estate, the orphanage had fallen into disrepair, its windows grimy and cracked, its halls echoing with the footsteps of children who had nowhere else to go. It was here that 9-year-old Henry Fuller first spoke of the tall man. Henry was a quiet child, small for his age, and prone to wandering off. The other boys teased him mercilessly, calling him Mouse and stealing his meagre possessions. But after one particularly harsh incident, Henry began keeping to himself, sketching endlessly in an old notebook. His drawings were strange, dozens of crude figures with impossibly long arms and featureless heads standing beneath crooked trees or in empty rooms. The other boys found the sketches unsettling, but Henry refused to explain them. "He's watching us," he said once in a trembling whisper. "He's waiting." The first disappearance happened 2 weeks later. Billy Carter, the loudest and meanest of the boys, vanished during the night. His bed was empty the next morning, his belongings untouched. The staff assumed he'd run away, but Henry knew better. "He came for Billy," Henry told the matron, his voice distant. "Billy wasn't nice, and now he's gone." The matron dismissed it as childish nonsense, but unease settled over the orphanage. The boys became quieter, their laughter replaced by whispered fears of a man with no face. When another boy, Charlie Myers, disappeared the following week, panic set in. Charlie had been a model student, well-behaved and obedient. The police searched the surrounding woods but found nothing, no footprints, no torn fabric, no sign of a struggle. That night, the remaining boys huddled together in the dormitory, whispering about Henry's drawings. "He knows something," one of them said. "He's drawing what's going to happen." Henry sat alone in the corner, clutching his notebook. He seemed smaller than ever, his eyes sunken and shadowed. The matron, desperate to maintain order, decided to confiscate the notebook. When she demanded it, Henry's reaction was violent and sudden. "You can't take it!" he screamed, tears streaming down his face. "If you take it, he'll get me too." She pried it from his hands anyway. That night, Henry disappeared. The police investigation turned up no leads, and rumours spread quickly through town. The children whispered about a curse, while the adults muttered about madness and mismanagement. Willowbrook's reputation plummeted, and within a year it closed its doors for good. But the story didn't end there. Decades later, urban explorers discovered the abandoned orphanage. Among the crumbling walls and rotting furniture, they found Henry's notebook tucked under a floorboard in the dormitory. The pages were filled with more drawings, but as they progressed, the images grew darker and more detailed. The tall man, faceless and towering, appeared over and over. In one drawing, he loomed over a group of children huddled beneath their beds. In another, he stretched his long, claw-like fingers toward a boy clutching a book. The final page was different. It showed only the tall man, his limbs tangled around the orphanage itself, as if he were part of the building. Beneath the drawing was a single sentence scrawled in shaky handwriting. "He is the game, and we are the pieces." The explorers posted their findings online, sparking debates about the legend of the tall man. Some claimed the notebook was a hoax, while others believed it was a genuine artifact of a sinister force. Those who dared to examine the notebook often reported strange occurrences afterward: unexplained noises, fleeting shadows, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. And those who ignored the warnings, those who dared to mock the story, sometimes disappeared altogether. The Willowbrook Home for Boys still stands, a husk of its former self. Locals warn against visiting, especially at dusk. They say the whispers begin when the light fades, faint and melodic, calling names that sound oddly familiar. And if you listen closely, you might hear the laughter of children, or their screams. In the summer of 1986, journalist Carolyn Greaves received an anonymous tip that led her to the crumbling ruins of Elmwood, New Haven, and the Willowbrook Home for Boys. The tip came in the form of a plain envelope containing nothing but a photograph of the circle and X symbol and the words, "Follow the thread, he's waiting." The symbol sparked a memory for Carolyn. As a child, she had seen it carved into the trunk of a tree behind her childhood home. Her mother had warned her never to play near it, but she never explained why. Now, as an investigative journalist, Carolyn was determined to uncover the truth. Her research led her to stories spanning centuries, folklore of the tall man, disappearances and strange symbols etched into stone, wood, and even flesh. Each story was disconnected from the others by time and geography, but the details were eerily consistent. Her first stop was Elmwood, now a ghost town overtaken by nature. The blackthorn forest loomed ominously, its gnarled branches seeming to reach for her. In the centre of the decayed town square, she found the fountain described in old records. The circle and X symbol was still there, carved deep into the stone, its edges smooth as if worn by countless hands. As she examined the symbol, Carolyn felt a presence, a subtle, oppressive weight in the air. It wasn't until she turned to leave that she noticed the shadows. They were longer than they should have been, stretching towards her even though the sun was directly overhead. She left in a hurry. Her next destination was the overgrown remains of the First Baptist Church in New Haven. The town's few remaining residents were tight-lipped, their faces pale when she mentioned the fire. The churchyard was an eerie, silent place, choked with vines. Deep in the undergrowth she found the wooden effigy. It was smaller than she had imagined, but unmistakable in its grotesque simplicity. When she touched it, the whispers began. Soft, melodic voices called her name, their tones blending into a dissonant harmony that filled her head. She stumbled back, clutching her ears, and ran to her car, swearing never to return. Finally, she visited Willowbrook, where the air was thick with mildew and decay. The building seemed alive in its rot, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet. In the dormitory, she found the loose floorboard where Henry Fuller's notebook had been discovered. The notebook was gone, but something else was there. A photograph of Carolyn as a child, standing in front of the tree with the carved symbol. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, were the words, "He remembers you." Carolyn's blood ran cold. She fled the orphanage, but the whispers followed her home. Over the next few weeks, Carolyn's life unraveled. She began to dream of the tall man, his elongated limbs twisting unnaturally as he moved closer and closer each night. She saw him in her waking hours, always at the edge of her vision, standing in the shadows or reflected in mirrors. Desperate, she pored over her research, connecting the dots between the stories. The tall man was not just a monster, but an ancient being, a predator that fed on fear, guilt, and despair. He was tied to the land, a constant presence through generations. The circle and X symbol was both a warning and a trap, binding him to places where his influence was strongest. Carolyn realized she had made a terrible mistake. By seeking him out, she had drawn his attention. Her final entry in her journal was scrawled hastily, the handwriting shaking. "The stories are true. He's not a man. He's a hunger, an emptiness that sees us as prey. He doesn't kill, he takes. If you see him, don't look. If you hear him, don't listen. He'll never stop watching." Carolyn's body was found weeks later in her apartment. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but her face was frozen in a mask of terror. On her desk was the photograph of her as a child, now altered. In the background stood a faint, spindly figure, its faceless head tilted toward the camera. The tall man had claimed another story, another victim. And somewhere in the shadows of forgotten places he waits. Thank you for joining me here tonight at Nightmare Theatre. My name is Arthur Pembroke, and I'll see you again tomorrow night.